Welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alaina Beverly. I'm an Assistant Vice President for Urban Affairs at the University of Chicago and the founding director of Urban America Forward, a national convening of practitioners who are dedicated to advancing racial equity and economic inclusion in America's cities. And I'm delighted to be your host for season 2 of the African American Mayors Association, Our Mayors podcast series. Joining us today is the Honorable Muriel Bowser, Mayor of Washington, D.C., and board member of the African American Mayors Association. In this episode, we will discuss D.C. statehood and what it means for the growth, evolution, and authority of Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, Madam Mayor. How are you feeling today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
I'm pleased to hear it. Well, let's get started. You have deep roots in the District of Columbia. What does your role as mayor mean to you, and how do you incorporate your love for the city in the work that you do?
Well, thank you for that. And many people, when they come to Washington, or many people who are outside of Washington, writing about Washington, like to think that we're just the Congress and the White House and a bunch of lobbyists. And I like to remind people that people actually live here, 700,000 Americans. We have neighborhoods, we have businesses, we have families, we have parks, we have nightlife, restaurants, everything that every American city has. We pay our own way, we pay our taxes, and what's different about us is that we aren't represented in the Congress. And that means we're the only free democracy where that's the case. So I get to be mayor of my hometown, which is a huge privilege. And I get to speak for not only the 700,000 people who live here now, but the generations before me. And, laying the groundwork for the next generations. It's true that my family is one of those multi-generation families in DC. And I just bring the love of that history, my own legacy, but also what's so special about DC. And I always knew when I ran for mayor that I represented that bridge between what's so special about DC history from Chocolate City onward, but also to the future, because we know nothing in our city stays the same. It gets better, it improves, or it goes into decline. And so all of us are proud that we're a growing city, but that also has its challenges.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned that it's a district of 700,000 people, but because the District of Columbia is not a state, you also operate somewhat as a governor. Can you describe the complexity, the pros and cons of that role?
Sure. So there's no other jurisdiction in America like us. All right. We're not exactly a city. We're not exactly a state. And that's why we're called a district. So we function as a city, a county, and a state all at once. I operate the school district, unlike most mayors. I issue driver's licenses, unlike most mayors, and we operate Medicaid and our own correction system, unlike most mayors. And so unlike governors, we don't hold the title. We don't have a big state house or helicopters, or the things that a lot of governors do around the country. But for thousands of pieces of legislation and purposes, we function as a state.
Right. Okay. Well, but so for our listening and viewing audience, those who might not be aware of sort of the ins and outs of the statehood debate,
Sure.
Let's just take a step back and speak to the fact that the last two states to be admitted into statehood or admitted into the Union were Alaska and Hawaii back in 1959. So we're talking 60 years ago. If DC were to become a state, what would be some of the benefits benefits for residents? What would be the tangible sort of outcomes that residents could expect?
Well, I'll give you one example. We're all, very familiar with COVID and how much of the COVID response laid at the hands of governors and mayors across the country. The model, in fact, especially under the last president, was we're kind of wiping our hands of it, and we're sending all the decision-making resources and in a lot of cases down to the states. And in one of the big pieces of legislation to accomplish that was the CARES Act. And the CARES Act used a formula to determine who gets what. And for the first time, and I don't know when or ever, if ever, the Congress treated the district like a territory instead of giving us state funding. Now, why could the Congress do that? Yeah, so to the tune of $755 million, $750 million. And I don't care who you are or where you are, $750 million is a lot of money. In the middle of a pandemic, when we had huge outlays of emergency expenditures for testing, for getting schools back open, to providing bridge funding for our businesses that were shuttered, all of those things. Right. So instead of focusing on that, I had to spend a lot of time focusing on how we were going to get that money, $755 million. I dare say that would never happen if we had 2 senators there. It wouldn't happen. Instead, we had 50 senators focused on their states. Right. And the district's needs were just kind of thrown to the wind. So that's just a very practical example. Another is governors control their National Guards. The district doesn't, while we have a DC National Guard, it's controlled by the president. So when, unfortunately, when we saw the events of January 6th, our National Guard wasn't nimble to move on my command, but had to wait for the command of the president. We know who the president was then. So here we are not having the full measure of our defenses. Now, our Congresswoman has a bill to change that. But what would really change that is finally becoming a state that guarantees Americans the right of everyone else. Why if we pay taxes and we're citizens, do we not have the same rights as every other American?
Right. I heard there was a whole revolution fought about that.
Indeed it was. Let's act like it.
Well, maybe you can help us understand then, if DC is to become a state, how will that affect the dynamics between federal funding for some programs that do rely on the federal budget for funding? So you said you operate the school district. You said that you're responsible for Medicaid. You're also responsible for some of the funding that comes through for welfare. If we become a state and DC is responsible for the fiscal responsibilities for those issues, are we ready for that? And what are the implications of becoming a state for those issues?
Nothing would change. Every state in the union gets federal dollars for those programs. We wouldn't be any different. So every state is funded by the federal government to provide for Medicaid. We wouldn't be any different. We would get all of the formula dollars that we're entitled to for public education. We do have a special federal program that we would fund directly, but in the big scheme of things and the type of budget that we have, it's easily absorbed. The big federal outlay right now is in our criminal justice system because our courts are not state courts, they're federal courts. Our laws aren't prosecuted by a state's attorney, they're prosecuted by the United States attorney. Our prisoners, even our incarcerated residents, are in federal prisons. So the big thing for us to absorb would be that criminal justice system. But we want to, because the people who are in charge of our criminal justice system now, from the judges to the prosecutors to the supervising agencies, they're not accountable to us. they don't express what they do in terms of DC values. They can't be voted out or held accountable. And that is unlike any place in America. So a fully self-determined people want that responsibility.
Well, what other local reforms, just so that we can pinpoint what this means for local residents, what other types of local reforms would be impacted by statehood? I'm thinking about local reforms related to racial justice, such as the criminalization of marijuana, which has a disproportionate impact.
We have been fighting this issue because some Republicans, one of the indignities of not being a state and being a federal district is that any congressman can put a rider on legislation that stops us from doing something or overrides what our legislature has determined is the policy for the District of Columbia. And that's the case with legalizing marijuana. We call it tax and regulate here. And it was the case for clean needle exchange programs, which cost us a lot of lives in the district. It's the same for locally funded abortion services, which are prohibited by riders. And all of those things should be determined by the people who live here, not somebody who lives in Michigan or Western Maryland or Eastern Maryland, I should say. They should be determined by Washingtonians. So statehood removes the ability of Congress people who are just really trying to play games with social programs to score points at home from interfering with the will of DC residents. There's another thing. We went through a constitutional convening in DC to write a new constitution for our new state. And we were able to talk through as a community a lot of things that are important for us. And one of the tenets of our new constitution will be that we would have more democracy in DC, not just having at the federal level, but also at the local level. So our new constitution envisions adding 7 members of the DC Council. So right now, there's the mayor, 13 members of the council, who pretty much make all of the policy and budget decisions for a 700,000 person jurisdiction. And some of us think that we need more democracy. We need more representatives, more people at the table. And we are moving towards adding those members to our legislature. We'll become a state legislature when we become a state, to have more democracy for DC.
Interesting. So you would become the governor, and then the city council, as expanded, would be the state legislature.
That's correct.
Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, you mentioned DC is known as Chocolate City, and it's been known as Chocolate City since 1957, when it was the first large city to be majority Black. But our numbers have shifted since 1970, when we were 70% of DC's population, to now where the Black community is roughly 40% or hovering around 40%, along with the white community of the district. Some would argue that we're only getting traction related to DC statehood because DC is no longer Chocolate City. How would you respond to that criticism?
I don't know that it's incorrect, and I don't know that it matters why we're getting traction. It matters that we get 2 senators, and I might put it a little bit differently. One way that I would put it is we have more people who live here now who have lost representation. They actually come from states where they had senators. And I think that they have been engaged by a very native movement for DC statehood, from people who have suffered the indignities, not just for their lifetimes, but their parents before them. And I would see it as gaining allies, not anything that we should be concerned about for people who care about autonomy and representation for the district.
Gaining allies. I like that. I mean, one of the most effective tools for representation is diversity, right? One of the most effective tools to address racial and economic injustice is having representation. What we've seen in the last few years is a real bright spot in the number of African-American women mayors and millennial mayors across the country. How do you feel about this? Do you see that trend continuing? And what do you think is the reason for it?
Well, I think the reason is people are running and they're winning. And it's really there's no magic there. And let me explain what I mean by that. When women who are awesome and have demonstrated they're awesome in every walk of life put themselves in front of the voters, guess what? They get elected. So if there's any magic, is that more people are throwing their hats into the ring and more Black women are throwing their hats into the ring. I do also see, I will say, having done 6 campaigns now on or five in 5 elections. I'm thinking about the next one, so that's why it's on mine. But it's just that I do see a change in how the electorate perceives women executives. And I think that's very positive. And I think the more female executives that there are, it will soften the ground for even more all the way up to the top. And I think that's a shift that I see. We've had women serve in Congress, on school boards and state legislatures, but we still haven't cracked a big one, and that's African-American female governor. We just have to keep pushing to get one of our sister mayors or county executives or to do it, because it's going to make a difference when it happens.
Amen. Black girl magic is real too. I mean, in campaigning for Barack Obama, Alfre Woodard said, whenever you touch a Black woman, you create change, right? So it's Black women make the change. And, we were all about hope and change at that point. So, but I digress. You mentioned that our previous president called the National Guard on the Black Lives Matter protesters and allies of all races standing for justice right in front of the White House. If we were to become a state, who would we encounter, and how are we protected as protesters and demonstrators? Actually, maybe if you could help us define who we encounter now and what that would look like if we were to achieve statehood.
Well, that is kind of a complicated question to answer, but let me just say what our role is as a city. We have an awesome police department in the Metropolitan Police Department who for decades has worked with federal police to patrol federal property. So there are lots of police departments in DC that are associated with federal properties. For example, the Secret Service is responsible for the White House. The United States Capitol Police is responsible for the United States Capitol. And they work for different branches of government, okay? The executive and the legislature. We support them all because we have the biggest force. So the United States Secret Service would never be able to police a large-scale demonstration on its own, and same for the Capitol. So we work in a consortium and for all the federal folks, us, and our neighboring jurisdictions in Fairfax and Montgomery and Prince George's. So to say, this is what we have. We have an inauguration. We're going to have 1 million people show up. We have the 1 million women's march. We're going to have 1 million ladies here, or we're going to have a big demonstration. So we plan with each other on how to support that.
Okay, it's
So that's a long
collaboration.
answer to your question. But if there is a demonstration in front of the White House, the first responsible agency is the United States Secret Service. More than
Okay.
likely, they're going to ask the Metropolitan Police Department, our department, DC Police, supported by DC taxpayers, to support it. We all have the ability in the National Capital Region to call on the DC Guard to offer support. And we do that primarily when we need traffic control and support. These big marches, frequently the way to keep them safe is not to allow a lot of traffic. Somebody better at talking about logistics can tell you why it's important. But we try to maintain a traffic box to keep everybody safe. Our job is to allow people to exercise their First Amendment rights and do it safely.
Right.
And that means demonstrators have to be lawful. Sometimes there are counter demonstrations that have to be lawful. And we don't want anybody to get hurt. And we don't want any property to get damaged. And we want everybody to go home safe and alive and sound. And so that's how we approach it.
Okay, well, thank you for that breakdown. I mean, I think that as residents, we're very active, politically active people, families, individuals, and so it is reassuring to know that DC's presence is pretty much the first responder for large scale demonstrations, depending on where the demonstration is located, right? And then all of the logistics that are handled in order to get safe streets for our demonstrations. That is also part of keeping us safe, and that's good to know. Now, we are in an unprecedented opportunity, or perhaps a new era of opportunity with the Biden-Harris administration. I know that the administration works closely with the district. What is the one priority issue that you would advance, that you think you could work together with an administration to advance the rights of African Americans and people of color? I'm sure that there's more than one, but
yeah, I think there are a lot, trust me, but I think the hardest nut we have to crack right now, and I'm sure all of my fellow mayors sympathize with the point I'm about to make, but the level of violence in our cities and towns is off the charts. And it is affecting the Black community more than anything. I think most urgently, that is our issue. How followed closely by how do we close some of the wealth gaps in our cities and towns and get people who are disconnected from work and opportunity connected to work and opportunity so that they can afford to live in our cities. You mentioned a point earlier that we're about 40% African American in our city. And, we have some quarrel with, the latest census. So that may shake out a little differently soon. But part of that is, I heard a statistic I couldn't believe, but in June, the average home price this past June, still pandemic, was $1 million. Okay.
You're kidding.
I'm not. So what we're going to see is a concern about the race of people who live here, but also the socioeconomic background. Nobody will be able to live here who doesn't come with some wealth and of any race. So we need I've spent 6 years really focused on how do we attract good paying jobs here and make sure that more people can get in those good paying jobs? How do we invest in affordable housing programs? I hope you'll address it in some forum, what we're doing on affordable housing. I led for the National League of Cities a housing task force that set out a national agenda. Big cities, small towns, Democrats, Republicans, of what we need from the federal government to do with us on housing. So I also think that the Biden-Harris administration can revive HUD and really make it a housing agency and help us tackle some of those really, really big problems. We believe we're a housing first city. We believe when people have safe and affordable housing, then their trajectory for education and economic opportunity takes off. We know that the wealth in our city primarily, and especially for African Americans, is in home equity. So how we get people on that path will begin to change and close those gaps.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to hearing more about that, given that Secretary Marcia Fudge is intent on increasing affordable housing and trying to explore some voucher reforms that might make it easier for individuals to secure more affordable housing in the city. And I'm sure that you're working closely with her. So hopefully we'll be able to continue that conversation.
Well, we're super excited about her tenure. And selfishly, she hired her undersecretary was a former public housing administrator for us in DC. So she knows our issues well, not to put them on the spot, but we are expecting big things.
That's great. That's great. Well, as we close, how can our viewers and our listening audience learn more about your priorities and about the issue of statehood?
Well, we have a website. Let me make sure I get it right. dcstatehood.gov, I think. Yeah, statehood.dc.gov. And that includes all of our information. But I'll say finally that this can happen. It's not a pipe dream. I think some people kind of talk about statehood like it's a fantasy. I don't do fantasy work. I'm just going to tell you, I wouldn't have dedicated this much of my life and energy and having to sit at that Congress if we hadn't laid out a plan to get there. It's not a fantasy. It's not a dream. But it is, we are kind of at a point of urgency because we have the White House and a president that supports us. We have Nancy Pelosi, who gets things done that she wants to get done. We have the Senate right now, but that could change. So the things that affect our democracy, like the John Lewis Voter Protection Act, like statehood for Washington, they have to be pulled out of this Jim Crow relic of 60 senators, supermajority needed to pass a bill. We have the support to pass this bill, and it has to be pulled out of the filibuster. So the thing that I would ask people to do, if you want to support statehood, is wake up, recognize that the time is now to deal with the filibuster and protect the votes of Black and Brown people across our country. It makes the country better for everybody.
That's the perfect closing. This is not a fantasy, but we have to act now. So thank you so much, Mayor.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be in discussion with you.
Thank you. Have a good one.